On a late afternoon in September 1949, the Cleveland Municipal Airport buzzed with the anticipation of more than 70,000 onlookers. Their attention was fixed on a heavily modified P-51 Mustang, its sleek form now radically reshaped for speed and given the name Begin. The aircraft was hurtling around the racing course, its engine screaming at over 400 miles per hour, under the command of a pilot known for his daring long-distance flights, someone who had recently circled the globe in a mere 73 hours. This day, however, was his first experience with the tight turns and perilous close-quarter maneuvers of a pylon race. The Mustang, specifically acquired for him by a pioneering female aviator who held numerous speed records, bore little resemblance to its wartime origins. Its radiator had been relocated to the wingtips, and its fuselage smoothed to reduce drag, transforming it from a combat machine into a pure racing instrument. Then, during the second lap, an unexpected crisis unfolded. The aircraft abruptly cut inside the third pylon, attempting a drastic correction towards the fourth. Without warning, the Mustang rolled completely inverted, hanging upside down for a chilling moment before it plunged decisively downward, impacting a residential structure on West Street in the nearby community of Berea, Ohio. The pilot was killed instantly. Inside the house, a young mother and her infant son also perished. The family had only recently occupied the residence, having moved in just 4 days prior. Flames quickly consumed the home. 72,000 spectators watched the unfolding disaster with growing horror. The contest continued, and the checkered flag ultimately went to another pilot, flying a Goodyear F-2G Super Corsair. Later, when pressed by reporters about the incident, the winner offered a stark assessment. He believed the fallen pilot, despite his skills, had been out of his element, a cross-country aviator unsuited for the distinct temperament demanded by pylon racing. This catastrophic event would immediately bring an end to the era of air racing in Cleveland, effectively pushing the Mustang out of the public eye for more than a decade. Yet, despite this sudden eclipse, the aircraft itself refused to disappear. The P-51 Mustang, the very fighter that had once dominated the skies over Europe, was about to begin an unexpected second chapter in its existence. It would find itself deployed in Korea, serve with air forces in over 30 nations across 6 continents, and even perform an improbable mission cutting telephone wires with its propeller blades in the Sinai Desert. It would participate in the final recorded aerial combat between piston-powered aircraft in history. Even 4 decades after its last manufacturing plant ceased operation, examples of the Mustang would still be conducting combat missions in the Caribbean, while advanced jet aircraft circled above. This is the account of how the P-51 Mustang adapted and endured beyond the Second World War. When the global conflict concluded in August of 1945, the military leadership of the United States confronted an unforeseen logistical challenge: a staggering surplus of airframes. North American aviation alone had manufactured over 15,000 Mustangs during the war, with its Inglewood, California facility churning out more than 100 aircraft weekly at peak capacity. Now, these assembly lines fell silent. Thousands of these machines sat idle in storage facilities scattered across 3 continents, their upkeep costs rapidly exceeding any perceived remaining value. The solution implemented was both stark and absolute. Throughout America and Europe, crews began systematically dismembering perfectly functional fighters with acetylene torches, while 18-foot steel plates, dropped from cranes, were used to crush and break airframes in half. A teenager, captivated by aviation, witnessed this destruction firsthand at Cal Aero Field, near Chino, California. He was a high school senior, a boy who had spent his childhood meticulously clipping photographs of airplanes and assembling intricate wooden models, while other boys traded baseball cards. Now, he watched with growing dismay as mighty B-17s and B-24s were snapped apart like toys, their fuselages cleaved in 2 by falling steel plates. The experience was, he later recalled, almost sickening. Not long after, he observed vast, house-sized piles of aircraft technical manuals being ignited. A worker present at the site encouraged him to take as many as he could carry. The young man made repeated trips, filling his car with these documents, salvaging them from the flames. This indelible experience would resonate with him for the remainder of his life, solidifying a personal commitment to rescue as many aircraft as possible. Possessing limited financial resources at the time, he would nonetheless manage to accumulate enough to purchase an old warbird, storing it wherever space could be found. Sometimes, he would trade one aircraft for something else perceived as more valuable or unique. Gradually, a collection began to form. However, this young man represented an anomaly. Most Americans viewed surplus aircraft as little more than scrap metal. Well-worn P-51 Mustangs were often sold at auction for as little as $1,500, a price less than that of a new automobile. Each Mustang had cost the government approximately $51,000 to produce during the war. Now, they were being divested for pennies on the dollar. Certain foreign governments acquired them even more cheaply. Under the terms of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, formally signed in Rio de Janeiro in September 1947, numerous Mustangs were transferred for the symbolic sum of $1 apiece. The Swiss Air Force, for instance, procured 130 Mustangs from surplus stocks located in southern Germany for around $4,000 each in December 1947. Switzerland would keep these Mustangs in operational service until 1958, effectively replacing their pre-war Messerschmitt. Fighters with American aircraft acquired at a fraction of their original cost. The military, at this juncture, foresaw no continuing role for the propeller-driven fighter. Jet aircraft represented the future. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, having first flown in 1944, could already outpace any piston-engine aircraft in level flight. The emerging air forces worldwide were clearly prioritizing jet technology. The Mustang, it seemed, was irrevocably destined for the scrapyard. Then, the Korean Peninsula erupted. North Korea initiated an invasion of South Korea on June 25, 1950. Within days, the Korean People's Army, bolstered by Soviet-built tanks and overwhelming numerical superiority, had driven south across the 38th parallel. The South Korean military rapidly disintegrated. American forces stationed in Japan found themselves scrambling to mount a response. Commanders immediately identified a critical flaw in their preparations. While their new jet aircraft possessed impressive speed, they were fundamentally incapable of maintaining a presence over the battlefield for extended periods to support ground troops. The P-80 Shooting Star, in particular, consumed fuel at such a voracious rate that pilots barely had sufficient time to locate targets before being compelled to return to base. The round-trip flight from Japan to the Korean combat zone depleted most of their fuel reserves, leaving them with only minutes of available loiter time over the target area. Furthermore, these nascent jet aircraft demanded long, paved runways. Most Korean airfields were short, rudimentary, and frequently damaged by artillery bombardment. Jet engines were highly susceptible to ingesting debris, leading to engine flameouts. Consequently, these sleek, cutting-edge fighters proved largely ineffective at the forward bases where ground forces most urgently required air support. The Mustang, paradoxically, presented none of these operational liabilities. It possessed the capacity to remain over the battlefield for hours, could operate effectively from unimproved dirt strips that would incapacitate a jet engine, and was capable of carrying 1,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, or napalm. Crucially, hundreds of these aircraft remained in storage across the United States, awaiting the inevitable cutting torch. The Air Force initiated an urgent effort to reactivate Mustangs from mothballs. Many had been relegated to Air National Guard units. Others lay dormant in desert storage facilities across the American Southwest. Crews worked around the clock, striving to restore these machines to airworthy condition. A substantial shipment of 145 Mustangs was loaded onto the aircraft carrier USS Boxer, bound for the Pacific. The Boxer departed Alameda, California, on July 14th, reaching Yokosuka, Japan, just 8 days and 7 hours later, establishing a new record for the fastest trans-Pacific crossing by an aircraft carrier in naval history. By the end of July, F-51 Mustangs were once again engaged in combat. The designation itself had undergone a change. In June 1948, the newly established United States Air Force had universally replaced the P for pursuit with an F for fighter across its entire aircraft inventory. The P-51 officially became the F-51, but beneath the updated nomenclature, it was fundamentally the same aircraft. The venerable warbird that had once escorted bombers deep into enemy territory over Berlin was now executing diving attacks on North Korean tanks. One particular young American pilot, possessing a mere 200 hours of Mustang flight experience, found himself serving with the Republic of Korea Air Force during those initial desperate weeks. He was part of a small cadre of American volunteer pilots acting as advisors and combat leaders for the South Korean forces. On July 10, 1950, while on a mission towards Shonan, this pilot discovered his radio had ceased functioning. At almost the exact moment, he spotted two North Korean tanks moving along a road below. He attempted to alert the other pilots in his formation, but without a working radio, his warnings went unheard. Faced with this immediate situation, the pilot made a decisive choice. He broke from the formation, executed a dive, and initiated an attack on one of the tanks, successfully destroying it. Then, following the trajectory of the road south, he located a convoy comprising 9 trucks and a half-track. These two he subjected to intense fire. When he eventually landed, his aircraft was critically low on ammunition. Following the mission, he barely managed to land at Haidong, then spent 5 days walking and hitchhiking his way back to Taegu. This incident encapsulated the nature of the war the Mustang would wage in Korea: close air support, interdiction, and ground attack. The romantic era of high-altitude dogfighting had essentially concluded. Mustang pilots were no longer hunting other fighters. They were systematically engaging tanks, trucks, and supply convoys. This was brutal, low-level combat, and it exacted a terrible cost. The Mustang's Achilles heel in this new role was its liquid-cooled Merlin engine. Unlike an air-cooled radial engine, which could often sustain significant damage and continue to operate, the Merlin was entirely dependent on its radiator, filled with coolant. A single rifle bullet penetrating that radiator meant the engine would rapidly overheat and seize within minutes. There was no possibility of gliding to safety. Pilots had mere seconds to eject or face certain death. The brilliant engineer who had spearheaded the Mustang's design team at North American Aviation watched these developments from California with growing frustration. He later articulated that the P-51 was fundamentally a high-altitude interceptor, meticulously engineered to escort bombers at 25,000 feet, an environment where its supercharged Merlin engine could outclass any other aircraft in the sky. To employ it in a ground support capacity, he argued, was almost a suicidal endeavor, given that even a .30 caliber bullet could puncture the radiator, causing the engine to freeze in 2 minutes. The Air Force, however, had made what was, in retrospect, a catastrophic decision after the Second World War. They had systematically scrapped their P-47 Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt, though heavier and slower than the Mustang, possessed an air-cooled radial engine renowned for its ability to absorb tremendous punishment. It was in essence the ideal ground attack aircraft. The Navy, in contrast, had retained its F-4U Corsairs for similar practical reasons. The Mustang, therefore, became the default option for the Air Force, and so the Mustang went to war. The grim statistics underscore the severity of the situation. A total of 335 F-51 Mustangs were lost during the Korean War. Of these losses, 264 pilots were either killed or went missing. A significant majority, 172 of those losses, were attributed to enemy ground fire. Only 10 aircraft were shot down by enemy jet fighters, with the remaining losses occurring due to accidents or disappearing without explanation. The aircraft's vulnerability was particularly acute during the winter months. Korean winters brought extreme cold and frequent icing conditions. Mustangs were not equipped with de-icing systems, and wing ice rapidly accumulated at low altitudes. An aircraft already overloaded, if it entered a stall or a spin, almost invariably failed to recover, a situation that amounted to a virtual death sentence. On the ground, conditions were equally harsh. Shelter at forward operating bases was primitive, with pilots and mechanics often living in tents or unheated structures. The brutal cold prompted some airmen to improvise heating systems using oil and highly flammable 100-octane aviation fuel. The predictable result was a series of fires and explosions that claimed the lives of men who had successfully navigated the perils of combat. Yet, despite these severe limitations and immense human cost, the Mustang continued to perform its assigned mission. It possessed the range to reach targets that contemporary jets could not, could remain on station long after jets were compelled to depart, and was capable of operating from forward bases that jet aircraft would never touch. North Korean troops soon developed a profound fear of the distinctive sound of that Merlin engine. Above all, they dreaded napalm. Pilots from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Squadron even developed a hybrid napalm mixture incorporating thermite, designed to burn with such intensity that it could melt the rubber directly off tank road wheels. These relentless attacks compelled North Korean forces to restrict troop movements primarily to nighttime hours and to camouflage everything meticulously. Soldiers resorted to hiding their vehicles under any available cover, sometimes even driving tanks directly into houses or haystacks to evade the Mustangs circling ominously overhead. The Royal Australian Air Force's No. 77 Squadron operated Mustangs in Korea from July 1950 until April 1951, before transitioning to Gloucester Meteor jets. They sustained substantial casualties during this period while providing crucial assistance to other United Nations forces engaged in fierce combat against North Korean positions around Pusan. Australian Mustangs also escorted American B-29 bombers on their missions against enemy airfields. The South African Air Force's No. 2 Squadron flew Mustangs from November 1950 until their conversion to F-86 Sabres. Their losses were severe, with 12 pilots killed in action and 30 reported missing. The South Africans, operating as part of the United States 18th Fighter Bomber Wing, earned a reputation for exceptional professionalism under intense fire. The South Koreans, for their part, continued to fly Mustangs throughout the entire war. For them, it was not a matter of choice, but of necessity. They simply could not afford jet aircraft. The Mustangs served as the backbone of their fighter force, flown by pilots fighting for the very survival of their nation. Some of these Korean pilots were veterans who had previously served in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Services during the Second World War. They understood how to fly, how to fight, and that they might not return home. By 1953, the Mustang was finally being phased out, replaced by newer jet fighter bombers. The F-84 Thunderjet and the F-86 Sabre assumed the primary ground attack responsibilities. The last American F-51s were transferred to the South Korean Air Force in January of that year, signaling the definitive end of the propeller fighter era in American service. The very last P-51 Mustang assigned to the United States Air Force, an F-51D belonging to the West Virginia Air National Guard's 167 Fighter Bomber Squadron, was formally withdrawn from service on January 27, 1957. It was then retired to what was then known as the Air Force Central Museum. However, for a fleeting moment on May 6, 1957, this venerable aircraft was reactivated for a ceremonial flight at the 50th anniversary of the Air Force's aerial firepower demonstration, held at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. One final, poignant flight for the old warrior. But in other parts of the world, the Mustang story was only just beginning. In the summer of 1948, a nascent nation named Israel found itself engaged in a desperate fight for survival. The British Mandate over Palestine had concluded in May, and the State of Israel had declared its independence. Within hours, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq launched a coordinated invasion. The newly formed country possessed almost no air force, relying on a makeshift collection of light, civilian aircraft adapted for military use and a handful of Czechoslovakian-built Avia S-199s, which were barely airworthy. Israeli agents in the United States began searching for fighter aircraft. They located 4 P-51 Mustangs available for purchase. The significant impediment, however, was that America had imposed an arms embargo on the Middle East. President Harry Truman, while supporting humanitarian aid to Israel, had explicitly blocked weapons sales, rendering the export of military aircraft illegal. A New York-born flight engineer, who would later establish Israel Aerospace Industries, coordinated the illicit acquisition. The Israelis devised an ingenious workaround. They created the Mustangs and falsely labeled them as combines manufactured by International. No one, it seemed, questioned what kind of farm equipment weighed 3 tons and arrived in crates shaped conspicuously like airplanes. The initial 2 Mustangs arrived in September 1948. Mechanics toiled relentlessly, day and night, to assemble them at a temporary airstrip discreetly located amidst orange orchards near Herzliya. Within days, these Mustangs were actively flying combat missions. They immediately proved to be the most capable fighters in the Israeli inventory, possessing superior speed and greater range than any aircraft the Arab armies could deploy. Their extensive operational range, spanning the entire Middle East, made the Mustangs invaluable for reconnaissance, ground attack, and interception duties. They could reach distant targets like Damascus and Cairo and return to base on a single tank of fuel, a capability unmatched by any other Israeli fighter. On November 20th, 1948, a Royal Air Force de Havilland Mosquito was conducting a reconnaissance flight over Israeli territory. British aircraft had been executing these missions with impunity, as no Israeli fighter possessed the altitude capability to intercept them. Earlier attempts had invariably failed. On this particular day, an American volunteer pilot scrambled in a Mustang from Castine Air Base. He climbed to altitude and successfully intercepted the Mosquito, ultimately shooting it down. It was a clear message. The skies over Israel now belong to Israel. On January 5, 1949, just 2 days before the final ceasefire of the War of Independence, 2 Mustangs were escorting T-6 Harvard trainers, which had been pressed into service as ground attack aircraft. They encountered Egyptian fighters over the battlefield. In the ensuing dogfight, the Mustangs shot down 3 of the enemy aircraft. This engagement marked the Mustangs' final air combat action of that war. Though the War of Independence concluded in early 1949, Israeli Mustangs continued to fly. Pilots routinely conducted reconnaissance missions over neighboring Arab states for years afterward. In April 1951, Mustangs, accompanied by 4 Spitfires, attacked Syrian positions at Al-Hama following an ambush by Syrian forces that killed 7 Israeli soldiers. In April 1954, when an Israeli Navy ship ran aground near Saudi Arabia, Mustangs provided air cover for the rescue operation. When recovery of the vessel proved impossible, they subsequently bombed the ship to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. By the mid-1950s, the Israeli Air Force began acquiring jet fighters, with Gloster Meteors arriving first, followed by Dassault Regains and Mystiers from France. The Mustang gradually lost its frontline role, and many were placed in storage. Only one squadron, number 116, remained operational, primarily tasked with training new pilots. Then came October 1956 and the Suez Crisis. Israel, France, and Britain had clandestinely agreed to attack Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The plan called for Israel to initiate the strike, thereby providing Britain and France with a pretext to intervene. The Israelis consequently retrieved their Mustangs from storage. A second squadron was quickly formed. Given their impressive range, these Mustangs were assigned the critical task of destroying Egyptian aircraft at distant airfields, some situated beyond the Suez Canal, deep within mainland Africa. However, the Mustangs also received a highly unusual and unprecedented special mission. On October 29th, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Two pairs of P-51 Mustangs raced westward across the Sinai Desert, flying at treetop level, so low that their propellers were almost scraping the sand. Their objective was to sever Egyptian telephone lines using their wings. Israeli intelligence understood that Egyptian command and control relied heavily on landlines traversing the desert. If these lines could be disrupted, Egyptian units would be unable to coordinate their defense. Radio communication at the time was unreliable, making the telephone system the veritable nervous system of the Egyptian army. A specialized device had been engineered for this mission, consisting of a weight attached by a cable to the aircraft's tail. The intention was to drag this weight through the telephone wires, snagging and cutting them. But during the mission, some of these devices unexpectedly detached. The pilots did not abort. Instead, demonstrating extraordinary resolve, they flew even lower, utilizing their wings and propeller blades to slice through the wires directly. It was an act bordering on suicidal bravery. At such an extremely low altitude, measured in feet rather than hundreds of feet, a single miscalculation meant instant death. The pilots succeeded. Egyptian communications across the Sinai Peninsula were effectively severed just as Israeli paratroopers were dropping at the Mitla Pass. Egyptian commanders suddenly found themselves cut off, unable to contact their forward units. The ensuing chaos significantly contributed to the rapid Israeli advance. The Mustang had, once again, found an entirely new purpose. It was no longer merely a fighter or a bomber. It had become a wire cutter. Israel maintained its Mustangs in service until January 15, 1961. By this time, jet aircraft had entirely superseded them in the frontline role. But the Mustang had unequivocally proven itself adaptable far beyond anyone's initial imagination. While the Mustang was actively engaged in conflicts across Asia and the Middle East, it was simultaneously forging a distinctly different existence within the United States. Following the war, the abundance of surplus Mustangs attracted a new type of pilot. Men who had flown them in combat now sought to fly them again, but this time for sport. Air racing had existed prior to the war, with the Thompson Trophy race in Cleveland drawing crowds exceeding 100,000 spectators even during the Great Depression. However, those pre-war competitions typically featured custom-built aircraft, diminutive machines designed solely for maximizing speed. After 1945, the racing circuits began to admit military surplus aircraft. Suddenly, ordinary civilians could acquire fighter planes that had cost the government $50,000 for less than the price of a used automobile. The Mustang proved ideal for racing. It was inherently fast in a straight line, relatively forgiving to fly compared to more temperamental fighters like the Corsair, and highly amenable to extensive modifications. Racers systematically stripped away armor and armament to reduce weight. They meticulously smoothed the airframe and filled every rivet hole. They fine-tuned the Merlin engines to extract even more power. Some chose to relocate the radiator from the belly to the wingtips to minimize drag. A pilot named Paul Mance clinched the Bendix Trophy cross-country race in 1946, piloting a Mustang at an astounding 435 miles per hour. Jackie Cochran, in another Mustang, secured second place at 420 miles per hour. In 1948, Mance again emerged victorious, with Cochran finishing third. In that particular year, the top three finishers were separated by less than 3 miles per hour, making it the closest transcontinental race ever recorded. The Thompson Trophy pylon races in Cleveland showcased modified Mustangs operating at speeds their original designers had never conceived possible. Modified Corsairs and Mustangs routinely circled the course at over 400 miles per hour, subjecting pilots to tremendous G-forces during the turns. However, air racing was inherently perilous. In 1947, a pilot, Tony Genazzo, perished when carbon monoxide leaked into the cockpit of his modified Corsair during the Thompson Trophy race. His aircraft crashed while the race continued uninterrupted around him. Cook Cleveland won that year, setting a new record of 396 miles per hour. Then came September 5, 1949, and the fatal crash involving another pilot, the incident that had opened this account. The deaths of the pilot and the family on the ground ultimately spelled the end of the Cleveland races. Organizers could not justify the risk of another disaster in a residential neighborhood. The Civil Aeronautics Administration threatened to prohibit future races, and sponsors began to withdraw their support. From 1950 onward, surplus military aircraft were explicitly banned from competition. The Mustang racers were effectively grounded. These airplanes, which had so recently dominated the post-war racing scene, now sat idle in hangars and on tie-down lines, awaiting a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. They would not compete again for 15 years. In 1964, a boat racing champion decided to resurrect air racing, selecting a new location in the Nevada desert near Reno. This individual, a shrewd showman and businessman, secured a contract with ABC Television's Wide World of Sports. He convinced casino owners in nearby Reno that air races would attract substantial tourist traffic. He then located a small airport called Sky Ranch, situated on a plateau approximately 5,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by mountains and safely distant from any residential areas. The Mustangs, consequently, were brought out of storage. Pilots who had meticulously preserved their warbirds through the lean years suddenly had a compelling reason to fly them once more. A new generation of younger pilots, too young to have participated in the war, now discovered the visceral thrill of racing aircraft that their fathers had once flown into combat. Modified Mustangs, bearing names like Stroker, Voodoo, and Red, became legends of Reno. They regularly surpassed 450 miles per hour, speed significantly greater than the aircraft had ever achieved during wartime operations. The Reno races rapidly ascended to become the premier air racing event globally, drawing hundreds of thousands of spectators each September. The racing circuit continues to this day. Mustangs remain among the most competitive aircraft in the unlimited class. This relentless competition has pushed the boundaries of modification far beyond anything the original designers could have envisioned. Racing Mustangs now incorporate engines capable of producing over 3,000 horsepower, nearly double their wartime rating. Some have had their wings clipped for enhanced roll rates, while others feature stretched fuselages and extensively modified cooling systems. Remarkably, some of these machines have been actively flying for 80 years. They have outlived their creators, their initial pilots, and most of the nations they once served. Annually, at Reno, they continue to demonstrate that the Mustang's performance envelope has not yet been fully explored. However, the racing circuit represented only one facet of the Mustang's ongoing story. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the P-51 continued to function as a frontline fighter in dozens of air forces across the globe. The Philippines, for instance, acquired over 100 Mustangs after the Second World War. These aircraft quickly formed the backbone of the post-war Philippine Army Air Corps, and subsequently the Philippine Air Force. Filipino pilots deployed Mustangs against communist hook insurgents during the emergency period of the late 1940s and early 1950s. They also utilized them in operations against Moro rebels in the southern Philippines. The Mustang was also the inaugural aircraft, chosen for the Philippine Air Demonstration Team, established in 1953 and known as the Blue Diamonds. The following year, Indonesia obtained Mustangs from the departing Netherlands East Indies Air Force in 1949 and 1950, later receiving additional aircraft from the United States. Indonesian Mustangs were used to suppress numerous rebellions throughout the 1950s, including operations against the CIA-backed Permesta rebels in 1958. On May 18, 1958, an Indonesian Mustang achieved what remains the only confirmed aerial victory in the history of the Indonesian Air Force. A pilot, Captain Ignatius Duanto, flying a P-51D, encountered a B-26 Invader over the Maluku Islands near Ambon. The Invader was being piloted by an American CIA contract operative supporting the Permesta Rebellion. Duanto successfully shot the aircraft down. The American pilot survived, was captured, sentenced to death, and eventually released in 1962. Guatemala operated 30 Mustangs from 1954 into the early 1970s. Haiti possessed 4 Mustangs during the rule of President Paul Eugene Magloire from 1950 to 1956. The last Haitian Mustangs were retired in 1973 or 1974 and subsequently sold for spare parts. Sweden operated over 160 Mustangs, designated as J-26. Some were modified for photo reconnaissance and received the designation S-26. These particular aircraft participated in clandestine Swedish mapping missions targeting Soviet military installations along the Baltic coast in 1946 and 1947. This operation, codenamed Fallon, involved deliberate incursions into Soviet airspace. The Mustang's superior dive speed, capable of outperforming any Soviet fighter of that era, ensured that no aircraft were lost during these sensitive missions. The Chinese Nationalist Air Force utilized Mustangs against communist forces during the Chinese Civil War. When the Nationalists eventually retreated to Taiwan in 1949, their Mustangs accompanied them. The Communist Chinese forces, in turn, captured 39 Mustangs that had been left behind on the mainland. In October 1949, 9 of these captured Mustangs flew prominently in the military parade celebrating the founding of the People's Republic of China. The leader of the Communist Party watched as American-built fighters, adorned with new communist markings, passed overhead. But perhaps the most remarkable operator of the Mustang was the Dominican Republic. The Fuerza Aérea Dominicana received its initial Mustangs on September 29, 1948. The first aircraft were flown by Brazilian mercenaries, veterans of World War II, who trained over 100 Dominican pilots between 1948 and 1950. Over the subsequent years, the Dominicans acquired additional Mustangs, including 32 ex-Swedish F-51DS, purchased in 1952 and 1953. These Mustangs formed the crucial backbone of Dominican air power for over 3 decades. They were among the most vividly painted fighters in the world, sporting bright color schemes and distinctive shark-mouth nose art that gave them the appearance of aerial predators. Dominican Mustangs saw action during the Constanza invasion of 1959, when exiles attempted to overthrow the existing dictatorship. They flew again during the April Revolution of 1965, when civil war erupted and American forces intervened. During this American intervention, dubbed Operation Power Pack, a Mustang was shot down. It holds the distinction of being the last Mustang ever destroyed in battle. Yet, the Dominicans persisted in flying them. When their de Havilland Vampire jets eventually wore out in the 1970s and were not replaced, the Mustangs became the sole armed fighters remaining in the Dominican inventory. The colorful paint schemes gave way to camouflage, though the shark mouths remained a constant feature. In 1983, a Cuban intelligence ship repeatedly refused to vacate Dominican territorial waters despite numerous warnings. The Dominican Air Force responded by deploying its Mustangs. They strafed the vessel until it finally departed. Cuba retaliated by dispatching MiG-21 jets to perform intimidating low passes over Dominican air bases. The Mustang pilots, understanding the futility of engaging supersonic jets with propeller-driven aircraft, made a pragmatic decision. As one pilot later recounted, they went inside and hid until the MiGs went away. This humiliating episode ultimately convinced the Dominican government to seek American assistance. The United States eventually provided 37 Dragonfly attack jets. These Dragonflies subsequently assumed the ground attack and counterinsurgency roles. The Dominican Mustangs were finally retired in 1984, 4 decades after the aircraft's initial operational debut. 9 of the surviving aircraft were sold back to American collectors. They had, against all odds, outlasted every other Mustang operator in the world. But even before the Dominicans retired their Mustangs, the aircraft had one final war to fight. It was July 1969. The United States was preparing to land men on the moon. In Vietnam, American jets engaged Soviet-designed MiGs at supersonic speeds, with Phantoms and MiG-21s jousting over the jungle, deploying radar-guided missiles. The propeller-driven fighter, in this context, seemed an artifact of ancient history. Yet in Central America, a different kind of conflict was escalating. El Salvador and Honduras had been in protracted disagreement for years over land rights and immigration. El Salvador, a small and densely populated nation, contrasted sharply with Honduras, a larger but sparsely settled country. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans had migrated to Honduras, seeking employment on banana plantations and farmland. Honduran land reforms implemented in the 1960s displaced many of these immigrants, compelling them to return to El Salvador, a situation that fueled simmering tensions for years. The spark that ignited open conflict occurred during the 1970 World Cup qualifying series. El Salvador and Honduras were grouped together. The matches, played in June 1969, triggered riots in both nations. Spectators clashed in the stands, and the violence spilled into the streets. After El Salvador secured a decisive 3-2 victory on June 26, El Salvador promptly severed diplomatic relations with Honduras. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador launched an invasion of Honduras. Both nations fielded air forces that seemed to belong to an earlier era. Honduras operated F-4U Corsairs, the distinctive bent-wing Navy fighters of World War II. They possessed approximately 17 Corsairs in their inventory, a mix of F-4U, 4S, and F-4U, 5S. El Salvador, in turn, had Corsairs of its own, specifically Goodyear-built FG-1DS, augmented by a small contingent of Cavalier Mustang IIs. These Cavalier Mustangs were noteworthy aircraft, being modernized P-51DS, upgraded by the Cavalier Aircraft Corporation in Florida with enhanced engines, new avionics, and wingtip fuel tanks for extended range. El Salvador had purchased 5 of these, along with 1 dual-control trainer, just the year prior. The ensuing conflict became the last war in which piston-engine aircraft engaged each other in aerial combat. The opening aerial attack was almost comically mismanaged. A Salvadoran C-47 transport plane, never designed as a bomber, flew over the Honduran airbase at Toncontin on the evening of July 14th. Crewmen manually rolled 100-pound bombs out of the cargo door, attempting to destroy Honduran aircraft parked in the open. They missed every target. Nevertheless, the fighting quickly escalated in seriousness. Both air forces conducted ground attack missions against each other's troops and infrastructure. Mustangs and Corsairs strafed and bombed with rockets, napalm, and machine gun fire. On July 17, 1969, a Honduran Air Force pilot, Captain Fernando Soto, departed on his 4th mission of the day. He was flying an F-4U 5 Corsair, armed with 20mm cannons, his primary objective being ground attack, supporting Honduran troops resisting the Salvadoran invasion. As Soto and his 2 wingmen approached the combat zone, he ordered a weapons check. One of his wingmen reported that his cannons had jammed. Soto instructed him to return to base. As this wingman flew alone, 2 Salvadoran Cavalier Mustangs spotted him. They dove to attack. The Honduran pilot found himself in a desperate struggle for survival. The Mustangs were flown by Captains Douglas Varela and Lionel Lovo. They could scarcely believe their good fortune. A solitary Honduran Corsair, seemingly defenseless, directly in their path. Varela maneuvered for a kill shot. The Honduran pilot threw his aircraft into a series of frantic evasive maneuvers. Varela fired his .50 caliber machine guns, but missed. The lone Corsair continued to evade, its pilot broadcasting desperate calls for help over the radio. Soto heard him. He and his remaining wingmen immediately jettisoned their bombs and dove to the rescue. Varela, focused intently on the evading Corsair, was attempting to line up another shot when Soto descended from behind him. Soto opened fire with his 20mm cannons. The shells ripped into the Mustang. Varela's aircraft went down. The second Mustang pilot, Lovo, attempted to escape. Soto pursued him relentlessly, ultimately destroying that aircraft as well. 2 confirmed kills within minutes. But Soto was not finished. Following the dogfight, Soto and his wingmen continued towards their original target area. They then spotted two Salvadoran FG-1D Corsairs returning from a mission. Soto engaged them without hesitation. He shot down both. Captain Fernando Soto was credited with 3 confirmed aerial victories that day, 1 Mustang and 2 Corsairs. These were the last kills ever made in combat between propeller-driven fighters. His aircraft, F4U, 609, is preserved today at the Honduran Air Museum, adorned with 3 kill markings beneath the cockpit. The war ended the following day with a ceasefire brokered by the Organization of American States. Over 3,000 people perished in those 100 hours. Tens of thousands more were displaced. But the conflict secured a unique place in aviation history. Corsairs against Mustangs, propeller against propeller. The aerial battles of the Second World War, replayed one final time over the jungles of Central America, 24 years after the Great War had concluded. After 1969, the P-51 Mustang's active combat career was definitively over. Yet, the aircraft stubbornly refused to disappear. Remember the teenager who had watched Mustangs being systematically cut apart at Cal Aero Field in 1945? He never relinquished his vow to save aircraft. While working various odd jobs and painstakingly accumulating funds, he persistently acquired old warboats, one by one. Sometimes, he would exchange one aircraft for another deemed rarer or possessing greater historical significance. On January 12, 1957, his growing collection was open to the public. It was the first aviation museum established west of the Rocky Mountains. He exhibited his aircraft wherever suitable space could be found, necessitating several relocations over the years. In 1970, he collaborated with a car collector to display aircraft alongside classic automobiles at an attraction named Movie World Cars of the Stars and Planes of Fame in Buena Park, California. The venture proved short-lived, but the Planes of Fame name endured. By 1973, he had secured a permanent home for his museum at Chino Airport, the very same location where he had witnessed the destruction of countless aircraft almost 30 years earlier. The field that had once been Cal Aero was now enveloped by civilian aviation activity. Volunteers enthusiastically flocked to assist in restoring the aircraft to flying condition. He was not alone in this endeavor. Across America, former pilots and mechanics were engaged in rescuing Mustangs from junkyards, from the inventories of foreign air forces, and from neglected storage fields. They diligently tracked down aircraft in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. They painstakingly rebuilt wrecks salvaged from crash sites around the world. They learned to maintain Merlin engines, whose production by Rolls-Royce had ceased decades prior. The warbird movement steadily blossomed into a global phenomenon. Restoration shops specializing in World War II aircraft opened across the United States, as well as in Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. Parts suppliers meticulously tracked down original components and began manufacturing new ones to exacting original specifications. In the 1960s, a fully restored, airworthy Mustang might command a price of $30,000. By the 1980s, that figure had climbed to over $100,000. Today, an airworthy P-51 fetches prices ranging between $2 and $4 million. Historically significant examples with documented combat records have sold for more than $5 million. There are now over 160 airworthy Mustangs worldwide, with more than 200 listed on the FAA registry in the United States. Most of them still fly. They are featured at air shows from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, to Wanaka, New Zealand. They race at Reno. They appear in films. A prominent actor owns one and personally flies it, his Mustang appearing in a major film released in 2022. These aircraft frequently bear the names of the men who flew them in combat. Names like KRY Peace Mighty, Sierra Sioux II, and Man O' War. Their paint schemes faithfully reproduce the markings of fighter groups that existed 8 decades ago. The distinctive checkerboard tails of the Tuskegee Airmen, the red-nosed Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group, the blue-striped aircraft of the 357th. Inside the cockpits, restorers have meticulously reinstalled armor, plating, and decommissioned machine guns. Some even feature functional World War II-era radios alongside modern avionics. The overarching goal is authenticity, to preserve not merely the machine itself, but the profound history it embodies. In 2014, a Mustang named Sierra Sioux II completed a 3-year restoration by Air Corps Aviation in Minnesota. The restoration team meticulously confirmed that nearly every component on the aircraft was original to its 1944 construction at the North American factory in Inglewood, California. Only the engine mounts, ailerons, and flaps required replacement. It is widely considered the most original P-51 Mustang still in flying condition. Sierra Sioux II had served in European theater with the 402nd Fighter Squadron during the concluding months of the war. After 1945, it was sold to Sweden, then to Nicaragua, and subsequently passed through various civilian owners in America. Its restoration precisely recreated the aircraft's appearance as it was in April 1945. The aircraft earned both the Reserve Grand Champion World War II Award and a Golden Wrench Award at the 2015 EAA AirVenture in Oshkosh. In May 2013, a pilot named Doug Matthews established a world altitude record for piston-engine aircraft in a Mustang named the Rebel. He climbed to an astonishing 42,568 feet over Lake Okeechobee in Florida. The aircraft itself was nearly 70 years old, yet performed flawlessly. That record remains unbroken today. The aviation enthusiast who had dedicated his life to saving these machines passed away on August 19, 2016. It was National Aviation Day, a date established in 1939 to commemorate the birthday of Orville Wright. He had spent his entire adult life rescuing warbirds from impending destruction. His museum now houses more than 50 aircraft, many of which are in flying condition. His sons and the children of his friends continue his work. His son-in-law became one of the most celebrated warbird pilots globally. His grandson, too, is a 7-time Reno Air Race's unlimited gold champion. The legacy continues. The P-51 Mustang was conceived in a mere 102 days, designed to meet an urgent British request in early 1940. The British Purchasing Commission had initially approached North American Aviation with a proposal to construct Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. The president of North American, instead, offered to design a superior alternative. The prototype took flight in October 1940. It was intended as a stopgap measure, a temporary solution until more advanced fighters could be developed. Instead, it became the defining American fighter of the Second World War. The early versions, equipped with Allison engines, performed inadequately at high altitudes. But when British engineers integrated a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into the Mustang airframe, the aircraft underwent a profound transformation. The Merlin-powered Mustang could fly higher, faster, and farther than any other American fighter of its time. By late 1943, Mustangs were escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, deep into enemy territory. They accounted for nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air over Europe, and thousands more on the ground. They also escorted B-29 bombers to Tokyo during the final months of the Pacific War. After the fighting ceased, the Mustang reinvented itself repeatedly. It served as a ground attack aircraft in Korea. It became a wire cutter in the Sinai Desert. It was a counterinsurgency fighter in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Central America. It transformed into a pylon racer over the Nevada desert. It became a flying museum piece for generations who had never experienced the war. Machines are not typically expected to outlive their intended purpose by 8 decades. But the Mustang has. It continues to fly today because people, against all expectation, simply refuse to let it die. Preservationists who salvaged airframes from the scrapyard. Pilots who flew their ostensibly obsolete fighters into combat one last, desperate time. Restorers who commit years to rebuilding wrecks into award-winning aircraft. Collectors who invest millions to ensure the roar of those Merlin engines continues. The factory in Inglewood closed long ago, The last new Mustang rolled off the assembly line in 1945. But the distinctive sound of that engine, the unmistakable howl of 12 cylinders operating at full power, still fills the sky over air shows from California to New Zealand. It became something more than just an airplane. It became a living testament to an era that, despite time, refuses to truly end.